All right. Welcome, everyone. Can I just get, for those who I can see, can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We'll have folks joining in these next few minutes, but I want to respect folks' time. But welcome to our rescheduled Advent Christmas conversation on housing instability and housing security. I really appreciate you all being here, especially for those who were registered for the first date. I really do apologize for the reschedule. I was the staff in question who was down for the count. And as much as I would have loved to push through, my voice was a big part of this job is speaking, and it would not do you any good if you could not hear me. So I made it through. It was a rough week, but I'm happy to be here. And still within the Christmas season, we intentionally rescheduled for today. We are right at the end of the Christmas season. A reminder for all of us that, while we'll be talking a little bit about Advent, we are that Christmas, of course, the liturgical season starts after the 25th, and we are still in it. So happy Epiphany to all of those celebrating. My name is Mike Rios Keating. For those of you I have not had the pleasure of meeting, I am the social justice education manager. And so I am fortunate to work at a nonprofit, a social service agency that doesn't just have the emergency services and the charity work going on, as is in our name. But we also have a social justice team that is interested in asking that question of, why do we have clients, guests, residents showing up at our doors in the first place, right? And we know that takes to address those things, those bigger systemic questions. That takes education, that takes legislative advocacy, that takes community organizing. And so I feel very fortunate that over the last 6.5 years, I've been working on that team. I have colleagues that specialize in the policy legislative advocacy piece. My colleague, Elizabeth Leiden, is here. She'll be helping with some of the chat questions and doing some administrative stuff behind the scenes. So Elizabeth is on my team. She is our manager of community partnerships. And we work together with our communications team and our volunteer team because we recognize that the work is bigger than just what happens on the front lines at our actual programs. And so we're grateful that you're here because this is part of the work. Having these conversations in community is incredibly important. It is what I enjoy doing. It is my job to try to facilitate. And I don't consider myself a teacher or a keynote speaker as much as I do a facilitator, a community educator. And the reason I love the phrase community education is because I think by nature, it recognizes the knowledge that's in the room right now. We all are part of our housing system in the metro area in Minnesota in some way. And we all have experiences, knowledge to bring to the table. And so there will be a few times where I'll be, asking you to speak with each other, to share with the large group, because I believe that I hope that tonight we're able to have a conversation, as well as to give you some information and some resources moving forward. So with that, I would love to start with, any time that we come together in education, especially around social justice education, it's important to recognize the land that we're gathering on to learn from, but especially a conversation about housing and land and being sheltered and what that means to have a home. I couldn't think of a more appropriate conversation to recognize those nations that came before us here in Minnesota, especially. Catholic Charities Program sites are located on sacred Dakota land all across the metro area, and we are continuing to do work internally and in community with folks around Indigenous truth and healing for ourselves, looking at some of the stories and ways we've been a part of this narrative in the past. What is our current relationship with not just Indigenous communities in the Twin Cities, but also in the social service world, knowing that there is a disproportionate number of people experiencing homelessness who are Native American compared to the population in Minnesota. And so I'd love to just read, to center ourselves here today, an acknowledgement actually written by the Native Governance Center that says, Minnesota Makoche, or Minnesota, is the homeland of the Dakota people. The Dakota have lived here for many thousands of years. Anishinaabe people reside here too, and reach their current homelands after following the Medjay Shell to the food that grows on water. Indigenous people from other tribal nations also reside in Minnesota and have made innumerable contributions to our region. It is, I think, important to always place ourselves within the context of any social issue. We'll talk a bit about that tonight. And, you know, when we gather together in person, which given the last 2 days within Minnesota and the metro area, the weather, I am so grateful for this technology that I did not invite all of you to brave the roads. Our street in West Frogtown, still not plowed. So I have done my fair share of being pushed out of snowbanks, as well as doing my fair share of pushing in our neighborhood. So I'm glad for that. And when we gather together in person, oftentimes we are able to, you know, have a communal space thinking about this land that we're on right now. But I think that virtual spaces offer us a unique opportunity to think about your own space that you're in, whether you are in an apartment or a house that you own, or maybe you're on a plot of land or a piece of land. Do you know the history there? What is your housing story there? We're going to be thinking about that later on tonight, thinking about where we fit. What is my housing experience? What is my sheltered experience? Because we are not exceptions to that. We are part of that story in our community just as much as anyone else. So before we break out into just a quick get to know a small group and introduce yourself to each other, I would love to just name some things that I think are important for community discussions. One of which is I ask if you share with the large group, if you share in a breakout session, that you speak from your own experience. We all have stories about other people, but it's important to not share, especially sharing other people stories who are in your group. If you're someone who shares a lot, tonight's an invitation to take a step back. If you're someone who finds themselves more introverted, I invite you to maybe share with a group, introduce yourself, to at least, you know, push yourself, asking the question specifically, recognizing that you have something to contribute. Everyone here has something to contribute to the group. I am not an expert in this subject matter. I get so much of my learnings from our frontline staff, our leaders in our housing work, our policy team who are on the ground, especially in the legislative session, sharing with me their learnings. And so I bring a lot of this information from partners, from colleagues. And so this is not going to be a fixing housing insecurity. You're not going to leave with a nice bow wrapped up at the end of this. So there's going to be some non-closure and some work that I invite you to moving forward. So hopefully, if this is your first conversation around housing insecurity or homelessness, that this can be a launching pad or a beginning. And then my favorite way to think about confidentiality is what's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. It's simply to say that when we are sharing stories with each other, that the specifics of what somebody shares can stay, and then a learning can leave. And I hope that you are taking this to family, friends moving forward. And then if there is some disagreement, you know, we all have experiences and opinions on any given social issue, that I invite you to give people grace And also accountability is important. So if you've heard someone's story and you have had an experience that is important to you, especially someone who has firsthand experience with housing insecurity, it's important to push back sometimes, and to share a reality that someone else might not know about. So I am going to just quickly put us into, just for a few minutes, just to get to know a group that you'll stay with later for a second conversation. And if you have the ability to turn on your camera for an introduction to your neighbors, to other community members, I invite you to do that. But I have 3 questions here. And one is, introduce yourself. How did you hear about this event? Why are you here? What is interesting about this topic to you? And then the second is, when you think about the word homelessness, what are some images that come to mind? And does that change when you think about the phrase housing instability or housing security, right? Do different images come to mind for you when you think of those two, the issues or ideas? So I ask you to just introduce yourself to a small group, and then I'll pull you back in just a few minutes. Welcome back. Thank you. I'm always incredibly excited as a facilitator when people maximize the amount of time after the room closes. So I'm glad that it was actually interrupting conversation. But I would love to hear from maybe a few folks who wouldn't mind sharing with the full group. 2 things. One, if everybody could just introduce themselves, maybe where you consider yourself from, whether that is a community or an organization or a city. If you could just introduce yourself in the chat, that would be helpful for other people who weren't in your group. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. That'd be helpful. But for someone who wouldn't mind unmuting, to either share what was it about this topic that made you come, or that difference or similarity between those phrases that comes to mind for you. So feel free to unmute, and would love to hear from a few folks what you yourself shared.
Question. Well, I'm not shy.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary Huddle, and I live in Woodbury right now. I said in my group that I have been involved with Beacon Interfaith Housing Collaborative for a couple of years, and I was interested in hearing a different perspective on housing and stability. So,
thank you. Someone else who shared.
Hello, I'm Bill Kramer from Savage, and I go to Risen Savior Catholic Church in Burnsville. I've actually heard you speak before, Michael, at a little retreat that Grace Kolisak put on for our church, and you were the keynote speaker. But yeah, I mean, this is just a topic that has been of interest to me for several years. We used to have a little homeless shelter out here in Burnsville, a rotating shelter actually through the Matrix organization. And now Dakota County has put them up in hotels. But I mean, so homelessness are people that are without homes, and working in that environment really opens your eyes to all kinds of circumstances that people fall in that get them on the road to homelessness. And I think housing instability is the path that gets people there, and the housing situation in the Twin Cities and across the country is basically an affordability thing, where too many people are falling through the cracks without having ample income to support housing. Some things can, in my opinion, can be brought on by human circumstances, but still we should have solutions for that. I think the majority of people are just not making enough income, or are in situations of mental instability that it produces the situation where they end up in homelessness. And
Thank you.
yeah,
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate the idea of homelessness being a reality, and instability being a pathway that can end up there. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But does anyone else want to share either something that brings them to the table, or something that those images or concepts that come to mind when you think about these phrases? Okay, well, this will not be the last time. And I am, as a facilitator, I'm not afraid of silence. So there may be times I ask for folks, and I can wait for a while, it turns out, especially much more when I'm in classrooms, high schoolers and college students, they can give me quite a bit of silence. So I would love to start, we're coming into this conversation specifically framing this around Catholic social teaching, and our team was talking about this conversation within the context of the holiday season. And for those who attended an event a couple Advents ago, it was Advent and Anti-Racism. It was a conversation that we had in community around how do we make sense of caring about something like anti-racism within a season like Advent. What is it about Advent that pulls us into caring? And I shared a couple things in that presentation that I'd love to share with you today around how we typically think about the Christmas season and typically think about Advent, of this time of anticipation and celebration and preparing to celebrate, and there's joy and there's decorations, and that's absolutely how our family spends our weeks leading up to Christmas. But it was a mentor of mine when I have a background in Catholic social teaching, and a mentor. I was in her class, and she was specifically talking about Advent, and invited us to think about it a little differently. And she would say that she thinks that the season of Advent is for adults, in that it has become this kind of joyous, oftentimes child-centric, thinking about the joy and the sitting on Santa's lap. And obviously there's this commercialization that happens with Christmas, but specifically she was saying, I think that Advent is a dark time. It's a serious time. It's a time of waiting, and waiting for this event of a king, of a savior, being born in a trough into poverty. And the question that she asked us is, can Advent be a time where you're asking that question, not just how am I preparing for Christmas, but how am I preparing this world around me for the coming of a savior, right? Like, what kind of world would we want them to be born into, and how are we working to bring that world about? And so that becomes questions of not just charity and almsgiving, but questions of systems and social justice. What kind of a world, what kind of a culture do we want to create in this time of preparation and waiting? And to really plug into the gritty reality of the world around us, to recognize where we might not have created that world so far. And I just found that to be a really compelling invitation for how to think about the season, because this idea of Advent being for adults, being a little darker, being a little more serious, was something I had not heard before, and I think is an invitation for those who do this kind of work and are interested in this kind of work to say this can be a season for giving, and to ask questions about why these needs are here in the first place. And so when we think about Catholic social teaching, we, as many of you know, we have these principles of human dignity, community in the common good, preferential option for the poor, economic and social rights, among others. But something else I heard from, it was actually Ron Kriedemeyer, who used to work in our office and was actually very involved in the creation of these pillars, of these foundational principles back in the 90s, when the USCCB determined that we weren't really doing social teaching in faith formation very well, that people didn't really know how to articulate Catholic social teaching. So there was an invitation to come up with how could we create themes or pillars, and that's where those 7 or 10 pillars come from, was that effort in the 90s. And he shared with me that the first 4 are actually quite important, and intentionally the first 4, that they build off of each other, that human dignity says that all of those created in the image and likeness of God have inherent human dignity that cannot be taken or given away, right? That we are dignified people by being people. And so if we are to recognize that, if we are to recognize the dignity of the human person, of our neighbor, right, then it pulls us into caring for our community. It pulls us into something more than ourselves, right? And to ask the question of the common good, right? What is the common good? What is best for the common good, for my community around me? It invites us into a social way of being versus an individualistic way of being. And so then we're caring for this large community. And so there's a question of prioritization, right? Like the community, the word community is very large. It's a big umbrella. So where do we start? Who are we caring for first? And through scripture and through social teachings, we know that it is the vulnerable, the marginalized. That's where we need to be beginning. And so from there, the question becomes, okay, so how do we care for them? What do they need? What do they deserve? And that's where the economic and social rights come in. And so one of those social rights, and the one that we'll be talking about tonight, is under access to housing and shelter. And so there are, when we talk about social rights, when we talk about Catholic social teaching, and we talk about Advent being a time to think about how we're creating a world where we would want a savior to be born among us, right? Like what kind of world do we want to see? There are a lot of things to choose from. There are a lot of issues. And I will be the first one to say that I know everyone in this room may not consider themselves a housing advocate. That might not be the issue that brings you the most life. And I always tell people in trainings on advocacy and social justice and moving forward in that work, that it is more important for you to follow organizations and get involved in an issue that you feel passionately about, that makes you ask questions, that gets you angry, that gets you interested, than it is to do something for everything, right? Tonight is an invitation for those who are interested in doing something for housing security and working to eliminate homelessness. It's an invitation for that. But I recognize that there are a lot of issues. And so tonight we're going to follow this. If you have ever been to one of my workshops, I'm a big fan of the pastoral circle, the praxis spiral, and it follows this way of what, so what, and now what, right? So that anytime we have an experience, we have, what is the experience? We use our values, like Catholic social teaching, to figure out why it matters. And then we have to figure out, okay, if it matters to us, what are we going to do to make a difference? How are we going to act? And that action will hopefully lead to a new experience, right? And so then it starts over again. That's the idea. And tonight we're going to switch it up a little bit, and I'm going to start with that so what, because we're going to start with the why should we even care about this in the first place, right? Like, what is it about Catholic social teaching that pulls us into this issue just as much as any other issue we find important? So we can start with a question. Why should we focus on this part of the church's tradition? Given the challenging nature of the church's social teaching and the complexity of implementing in the contemporary world, why bother? Why should we worry about applying Catholic moral values in the social arena? why not leave the function of promoting social justice to the activists and the specialists? And that is a question I have received from people in community. Like, why not just let the organizers and the activists care about this, and we will continue to do charity, to care for the poor in that way. And I'm going to skip to this answer, which is, the central message is simple. Our faith is profoundly social. We cannot be called truly Catholic unless we hear and heed the church's call to serve those in need and work for justice and peace. We cannot call ourselves followers of Jesus unless we take up his mission of bringing good news to the poor, liberty to the captives, and new sight to the blind. So it's this idea that if we are to truly be caring about our neighbor, following these 2 feet of service, of charity and justice, that many times in our social teachings in the last 150 years, we have seen a call for changing policies, talking about the role of the state or the government, talking about systems. And so it is just incomplete if we don't care about both of these feet of charity and justice, right? And so Catholic social teaching at its core is a roadmap rooted in both scripture and modern church documents for how to engage with the ever-changing social issues of our day. And it is not dogmatic, it's not partisan, it's not a voting checklist, right? What it does is it gives us information that is based in what leaders have, church leaders, bishops' letters, encyclicals, what they have said, and allows us to make a decision about, okay, how is my faith and my belief informing what issues I care about, right? And so that's where we get these principles that I mentioned, which many of you probably have seen before. And so the last way that I want to frame this to get from Catholic social teaching to a particular issue is that I like to think about it as these kind of enveloped circles or umbrellas, right? So if Catholic social teaching is our values, that is really what is moving me into doing any action at all. It's the teaching that helps me navigate the question, how am I supposed to respond to the world in accordance to our values, right? Then social justice, along with charity, social justice is the definition that I'll use tonight, the pursuit of equal opportunity and access to social and political rights by way of removing systemic barriers and addressing root causes of economic, racial, and social injustices. So removing systemic barriers and addressing root causes, I very much recognize, and if you're here tonight, you probably have some level of understanding of these differences, but social justice has become a very heated word. And something that I would offer to you if you're having conversation with family or friends about that phrase is simply that if charity is the Band-Aid, justice is the cure. If charity is the emergency service of feeding someone food because they're hungry right now, social justice is asking, why are they hungry in a country with so much abundance, right? What is it about our systems that has led to that moment? And it's really about asking questions. It's going upstream. And I think generally speaking, people agree that both things are important. An immediate need and a root cause are both important to care about, but it has become quite inflamed. And so I think when we're able to take a moment and to get on the same page, that can go miles in terms of our conversations with others. And so from social justice, then we get into the various social issues, right? And so that's, for me, the umbrella and how it cascades into choosing something that is under social justice, such as housing justice or housing reform. And I will say, and maybe I'm biased because I have been in the housing world doing this kind of education and organizing for about 11 years. I worked at a university in Omaha, Nebraska, worked with students who would visit homeless shelters quite often. We're working on organizing in Omaha, Nebraska. When I lived in Guayaquil, Ecuador, I worked for a nonprofit, a Jesuit nonprofit that was doing community organizing around land rights. And then when I came to Minnesota, I've been here for about 6.5 years, working at Catholic Charities. And so maybe I'm biased in really believing that housing is incredibly important. But when we look at when we analyze these various social issues, we find that housing is going, and housing justice and housing instability is going to touch every single one of those issues I put up on the screen. That when we talk about economic justice, it is connected by way of the cost of housing or the vacancies for affordable rental units. In environmental justice, we're thinking about people experiencing homelessness and the access to nature or parks, escaping extreme climates, and the privilege that I have to turn on my air conditioner or my heater to regulate that temperature, right? Criminal justice reform, we can talk about the impacts of criminal history on renting, healthcare reform, the positive health implications of housing stability. Someone mentioned that, right? Like we know from many, many studies that when someone has a safe place to rest their head at night, so many things are able to follow that, right? Including recovery for addiction. And education, if we talk about education, not only is there questions around access to education when you are housing insecure, but also the ability to continue that education. We have plenty of stories from our guests and our residents of trying to maintain schooling and the difficulty of that when you are highly mobile, right? And then racial justice, whether it's home ownership disparities across race, tenant discrimination, we can touch all of these various issues. And so I'm not here to say that it's the most important issue, but it's a helpful practice, this idea of intersectionality and social analysis, to take any given issue and say, how does it touch other systems? And this is why it's so hard to solve when someone said, what is the solution to homelessness? Or to housing insecurity. This is one of the reasons why it's not just a clear-cut answer, right? And so to kind of wrap up the so what, I think it's important for us, if we're really going to be diving into Catholic social teaching, if we're really going to be trying to make the case to people who believe in the Catholic faith, in scripture, in Catholic social teaching, to make the case for housing advocacy and housing and advocating for housing security in your community, then we have to start with, where can we see it already? Where do we see it in text and in documents? And I think the first thing that comes to mind for folks is the corporal works of mercy, which is not in and of itself in scripture, but is often attributed to, the passage from Matthew. And for me, I think I am always surprised to remember that homelessness in itself, like shelter the homeless, is not in that verse. That is, they mention food and thirst and welcoming strangers and clothing, but it's not actually in there, right? And it's important for us to remember that anytime we're looking at scripture, we have to be able to make that shift to thinking about the context of the time. And so you may have seen a list of corporal works of mercy where it's called Harbor the Harborless or Shelter the Traveler. And oftentimes you'll find in scripture, they're talking about migrants or travelers, and that's who you should take in, or just the poor who you should take in, right? Not necessarily naming that they don't have shelter, but at that time, that would be an assumption. At that time, if you are traveling, you don't have a permanent residence. And if you are poor, you likely did not have a permanent space to stay. And so these inferences can be made. And that is why, the kind of modern corporal works of mercy have come to include it. But we do find it in spaces like twice in Isaiah, talking about, is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover him and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. Or for you have been a stronghold to the poor, a stronghold to the needy in distress, a shelter from the storm and a shade from the heat. For the breath of the ruthless is like a storm against a wall. So I don't think that it takes too much of a convincing for people to recognize that when we're talking about the poor and marginalized, those without shelter are included, right? But then we can go into the social documents, and every time that I look into these, and in my grad school where I had to read most of them, I'm always surprised at how specific some of the issues are that popes and bishops call out. Like, oh, we actually do say something about this in the last 150 years. And so, dating all the way back to the very first, what we would consider the first modern document of Catholic social teaching, Rerum Novarum, which was about workers' rights, and it followed the Industrial Revolution, talked about the workers' rights to being housed, clothed, bodily fit, that because those are the things that would make their lives more endurable, right? And less hard. And then we move on to the year 1919, and we have decent housing that is called out in when we're talking about persons being more than property in a Jim Crow era. And this was incredibly important. A lot of things to talk about, but named housing in particular. Even specifics, 1961, specifics on housing within rural communities, right? So talking about the needs outside of metropolitan areas, there's this list, and in there is included housing. And this is something that we have conversations with central Minnesota, with greater Minnesota advocates, representatives about how, we often hear housing security or homelessness as an urban issue, right? And when I first started at Catholic Charities, we had a one-pager that showed that if you look at all of our guests and clients and residents, every single county in the state of Minnesota is represented, right? And so, sure, folks are migrating to places where services are, but that means that there is a need for services, for housing, for affordable housing in other spaces outside of the urban development. On dehumanizing living conditions for families, this is one of, I think, the most potent and surprising for me, because Pope Paul the Sixth calls out families living in dehumanizing conditions, that young couples are waiting in vain for a decent dwelling at a price they can afford. They're being demoralized in that process, that youth are escaping from confined units out into the streets, experiencing homelessness themselves. And this was, 50 years ago. And we're still having the same conversation today about youth homelessness, about the price of dwellings, right, that are decent. And then two more on the lack of housing, generally speaking. Pope John Paul II first talked about that, that the lack of housing should be seen as a sign and a summing up of a whole series of shortcomings, which I think is a pretty powerful statement. And then Pope Francis in Laudato Si talks about housing within the context of an ecological problem, that having a home has much to do with a sense of personal dignity. And that's what we believe at Catholic Charities. That's what our housing programs are founded on, that we, when it comes to housing and shelter, it's a matter of living a dignified life, right? And so if Catholic social teaching is to be a roadmap through complex issues and needs in this world, then we have to be able to then take new information and discern what it means for our call to walk with those most in need. So it's one thing to look at these documents from the last 150 years and to say, yes, leaders have commented on it before, so I should care about it. But those issues are different now, right? Apartment complexes and how those function are different today than they were 100 years ago, right? The way in which people own property looks different now than it did 50 years ago. And so the Catholic social teaching is not a static, but a dynamic effort to say, what is the issue today? What are the issues that are affecting our community today? How are they changing and evolving? And what can we do about it in today's circumstances? And so in summary, why we care, why housing justice, why caring about this at all? Christ's teaching in the Old Testament encourage us to shelter others, certainly. Social documents call out equitable access to housing many times throughout the last 150 years. But perhaps most importantly, when we ask, what would I need to consider my life dignified? I know that everyone would have stable housing on that list, right? And so if we are to treat others as we would want to be treated, right? If we want to treat others in a way that is treating them as a brother and sister, then that has to be part of the list of what we're working for and fighting for. So I'll pause for a moment, and if any questions when we think specifically about the Catholic social teaching side of this? Any questions or thoughts or things that come to mind before we kind of shift into the what, which is, the housing instability in Minnesota piece? Some of that may have been repeat for you. I think it is important every now and again for myself to remind myself, why is this work rooted in my values, right? I think if you've been doing work volunteering for the same organization for many years, it becomes part of who you are, which is amazing, right? If you've cared about healthcare or education for a long time, then it becomes part of your daily life. And I think it is important to take a step back and to say, but where did this start, right? Why is this not even an option for me? Why is this so important? Yeah. Yes, Elizabeth.
I was just going to ask, because I've gotten this question when I've been talking to people out in community. I think all of us think of housing differently, meaning like some people say like, so do you mean that it's not dignified if someone doesn't own their own home, or what? How do you approach that, Mike, in terms of kind of defining that boundary between dignified and undignified housing?
Yeah, I did not plan to Elizabeth to ask that question, but there's a slide on that. So that is wonderful. Well, I encourage any questions that you have throughout, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we keep going here. So now that we have this kind of foundation of why is housing in the list of things that we as people who believe in these values, why is it something that we should care about? We can go into, okay, so what are we talking about? What can we do about it? What is the problem? But before we begin to explore others' worlds, I think it is imperative for us to examine our place within the issue. That is to say, our roles, our perceptions, our experience, our context. I hear often, the way that we talk about social issues sometimes is that if I am privileged in XYZ way, right, then education reform is about the kids who are falling through the cracks, right? It's kind of external to me, right? If I am college educated, then that's something else. If I am housed, if I own a home, then talking about homelessness is about an external issue, other people. I can care about them, I can do it lovingly, but sometimes I separate myself. And I think that is a missed opportunity for us to become deeply engaged in social issues, to say that I am not an outsider to any social issues because I have a housing story and I am interplaying in our housing system every single day. And so the follow-up question for you with your group is, this is a very broad question, but I invite you to think about your housing story. We all have a housing story, and that's very broad, and it's broad on purpose. So maybe you are just sharing your current housing setup, right? Maybe you'd like to share how you got to that current particular housing circumstance. Maybe it's a story of a time in which you weren't sure what your housing situation was going to be. Maybe it's about grandparents' land that is now your children's land, right? But think about where you are positioned within the context of housing and shelter. Try to be creative about the different ways in which you are plugging into this idea and this system in our community every day. And so maybe that is just sharing, currently, but I invite you, and again, going with the guidelines, you can always pass. You don't have to share anything you don't want to, but this is an invitation for you to be thinking about it for yourself and then share whatever you'd like to with your group. Welcome back. I know I interrupted stories, and I know that wasn't enough time. When I was first asked this question by a housing agency in Omaha, Nebraska, I remember thinking that I had never put to words thinking about my housing circumstance from the time I was born to the time that I was living in at that moment, and then was asked about my parents and my grandparents, and how have I sort of existed and experienced our housing system, right? From living with my parents to living on campus at a college, to living off campus at a college, to renting and not experiencing any trouble in terms of background check or income requirements, renting twice, and then now owning a home, right? Sort of living in that way through our housing system. And what have I not experienced by that being my journey, right? And so I know that wasn't enough time to break that open, but I encourage you to continue to think about that, because if we are to enter into, we're about to go into some statistics and some information, but if we are to really be able to take that for what it is, we have to be able to plug into some empathy and some sympathy. And I think if we consider ourselves external agents to this issue, then it will be really easy to just fall off at any time and say, this is taking up too much of my time, or I just don't, I'm not finding it as interesting, or I don't, it is easy to stop caring. And that is the case for any social issue. And so I invite you into coming back to this question of what are the ways in which your daily life has and continues to intersect with our housing and shelter system. And my immediate answer is like, oh, I haven't intersected with our shelter. If I wasn't working at Catholic Charities, I haven't intersected with our shelter system. Well, that is an experience. And so to hold on to that and to think about what that means for maybe some of your blind spots or your perceptions. So to get into the what, I want to start with, we are not here to talk specifically about homelessness. However, whenever a conversation around housing happens, homelessness, sometimes I have experienced a conversation shifting completely into talking about specifically unsheltered homelessness, which is important and one part of the housing continuum, one part of housing insecurity, right? And so I want to share here a federal definition of homelessness. So I want to ask you to share. If you, I want you put in the chat the HUD definition of homelessness, the Housing and Urban Development of Homelessness. To be homeless, you have to meet one of 4 criteria. And the sentence, I'll give you the beginning of the sentence. Last night I stayed in, and then finish the sentence. Put some guesses in the chat or unmute and give me a thought about what might be one of the 4 criteria for being federally considered homeless. Last night I stayed in a car. Okay, that is very specific. And the first one is much broader. It is a place not meant for human habitation, which would include under a bridge. So a skyway, a bus stop, a car, all of that is included under a place not meant for human habitation. That's one entire one. The other 3, which I don't think people think about as often, is emergency shelter. So if you're at a shelter, you're considered homeless. If you're in transitional housing, that means you can still do the intake for housing for emergency shelter if you're a family, for example. And so transitional housing is that in between. You are still considered homeless, but where they're trying to find you more permanent supportive permanent housing, right? And then lastly, exiting an institution like a prison or a hospital. If last night that's where you stayed, then you could get those intakes and be considered. If you called the hotline, you would be considered. What's missing from here? What might be missing? A situation where you yourself might consider yourself homeless, but is not on that list. Doubling up, right? So doubling up meaning staying at a friend's house, a sister's house, also not included on here. Yeah, couch hopping, another word. Also not included on here, a motel. You get a voucher for a motel for a certain number of days. If you call and they ask you where you stayed last night and you said a motel, that's not sufficient. So already we're seeing one barrier and one way in which the system, some people are slipping through, right? Just in a federal definition. And so keeping to just a couple things about homelessness first, before we go into the broader category, what we know about homelessness right now. When I started at Catholic Charities, the number for youth and young adults experiencing homelessness was 51%. At that time, we could say that over half of the people in Minnesota experiencing homelessness on any given night were youth or young adults, right? It's gone down since then. But when we say that we have a youth homelessness issue, that's what we're talking about, right? Children with parents are 32% of that, 15% youth on their own. Nearly half of these children are age 5 or younger. At age 5, all of a sudden you start to get different systems that come into play, like going to school, right? When we look at racial disproportions and disparities for African Americans, really just looking at number of people experiencing homelessness versus the population, 39% versus 5% are indigenous neighbors, 8% of homeless adults, 1% of the population, and 73% of homeless youth are youth of color, compared to 26% of all Minnesota youth. LGBTQ identifying would be 11%, and that's of the overall homeless population. But if we were to drill down into youth, that number would be much larger. And then those who served in the military, 3.6%. I put this in here because in this exercise I do with students sometimes around some of the perceptions of people experiencing homelessness, single adult males, veteran comes up quite a bit. And certainly that was true at a time. We have seen a steady decline in the last 15 years of veteran homelessness because federally and at a state level, we have said we are going to end veteran homelessness. Like, that is a goal. And to me, it is an exciting and important reminder that when we put resources into some of these changes, they can have incredible effects. And I think we see that with, in particular, veteran homelessness. And then some of the causes, right? So we're still talking about homelessness, but now we're creeping into a broader conversation about housing security, which is that number one, and I'll put it bold, lack of affordable housing, right? Lack of employment. Obstacles to maintaining housing include mental illness. 60% of those in 2018 that were experiencing homelessness reported struggling with some kind of mental illness. Chronic health conditions, abuse and violence is an incredibly important issue that is still continues to rise. Housing discrimination and other systemic inequities, like having a felony or having involvement with the criminal justice system and trying to rent, some of those barriers. And then I put intergenerational poverty in here because when we're talking about housing insecurity, when we're talking about people who currently have a place and are not sure where their next place is going to be, I remember so well a conversation that I had with a family at our family service center. And when I was talking to him about the experience of getting to the family service center, which is an emergency shelter in Maplewood, he said, you know, if I could sum up my experience getting here, it was that the people who wanted to help me couldn't, and the people who could seemed to not want to. And what he was saying is that he's not a drifter, he's not a loner, he has family and friends, but they were not in positions to house their family. They did not have a basement or an extra guest room where that was the case. Some of them may have been in Section 8 housing, and only a certain number of adults over the age of 18 could be in that unit, or else they risk their housing, right? And then those who could seem to not want to. He was talking about the system. He was talking about going to a place and someone losing their application, or having extremely overworked and under-resourced county intake officers, or who are trying to keep up with the volume. But the people who feel that volume and that under-resourced are people like this man, this father. And so it's incredibly important to, when we think about our housing story, we could add to that, what would happen if I lost my housing right now? Where would I go? Who would I call? What would I do? Right. And that is different for me versus him, because we have been swimming in different economic classes, right? And we currently, in terms of who we can turn to, I know people with a basement or a guest room. And so the reason why I started there, a lot of people want to talk about, okay, what is the cause of homelessness? What is the solution for homelessness? But when we zoom out and we talk about housing security, what we're talking about is those people who are also at risk of becoming homeless, right? Or at risk of having an unstable and are at risk of losing their housing in some capacity, right? So now we're talking about low-income communities, low-income households who are one car accident or hospital bill away from not knowing what is next, right? And so this is this circle of people at risk, people experiencing homelessness, and then how are we getting them housed? But how are we getting them stably housed with services to make sure that they don't become at risk again, right? So it's this cycle. And interestingly enough, there is a definition that the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and I feel like I'm dragging them through the mud, but that they say that when they talk about someone being housing secure, they're talking about the quality of the housing, right? They're talking about the structure. So they give a list of all of these things that if someone's experiencing these things, that would not be considered stable housing, that would not be considered adequate housing. And that is important, right? This is important because this is about dignity. This is about dignified living. Yes. So they give this list of, that would be their definition. And at Catholic Charities and a lot of other places, including the United Nations, in their Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of which is signed by the United States, they would say that housing security is about the security of tenure, availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy, which is considerably more expansive, right? There are researchers from University of Southern California proposed that we talk about housing instability, housing affordability, safety, quality, neighborhood safety, neighborhood quality, and homelessness, right? And all of a sudden, we're talking about something much, much bigger than the quality of someone's home or whether or not someone has shelter or not, right? And this takes work, right? And so this is the slide to your point, to your question, Elizabeth. What do we consider to be dignified living? And this is where we might get some pushback of people saying, well, if you're not working, do you deserve a luxury condo, right? No, that's not what this says either. It's saying, are your basic needs met? And is it culturally responsive? Is it a culturally responsive space? Is it safe? Is where you're living, how close is it to fresh food? How close is it to transportation, right? These are the things that we consider when we think about housing that is supporting a dignified life. And so security then brings us to the question of this continuum. And so if we are thinking about unsheltered homelessness as one end of the spectrum, right? Then sheltered homelessness comes next, right? And on the far other end is market rate homeownership, which is not the goal. I am not here to say that Catholic social teaching says that everyone should be able to or should own their own home. First of all, because some people choose not to do that. There are plenty of people in all brackets of income that choose not to own a home, right? However, what we would want is the access to affordable home ownership if chosen, right? And then in between there, we have this continuum of transitional housing, deeply affordable and supportive housing that comes with assistance, like permanent supportive housing as a program, affordable rental units, workforce rental housing. So it is a spectrum. And we hope that people are moving up to the point where they feel like they are stably housed, that they can look at that list of things on that last slide and say, yeah, I feel like this unit is it for me. Like I'd be okay if I was here for quite a while, right? To be able to be in that space is a goal. And that is often defined by the person, because we all have our own housing story. And that also comes with preferences and way of life and things that we're choosing to do and not do. And so it comes to this question of affordable housing, which many of you probably know, that when we are talking about affordable housing as a concept, it's thrown around a lot. By definition, we're talking about spending less than 30% of your income on housing, right? And there are a lot of different types that you may hear. You've heard me mention Section 8. There's public housing, which is, government, so something that is maybe a federally owned program, project-based Section 8. And then naturally occurring affordable housing, think of manufactured homes, or people call them trailer homes, or that those are ways in which you are not needing to subsidize it for it to be affordable, right? That's an example. Also, older homes that we see being flipped everywhere, that could be affordable because of some of the work that needs to be done, not in a safety way, but just older, smaller homes. And so we haven't, in many urban areas across the nation, left those to be naturally affordable, but are finding them to be investments, right? Investments to build on and to profit off of. And so some of the challenges here. I used this slide a couple of years ago, and I put it up to make a point that throughout 2011 to 2017, apartments that under $800 were plummeted. Okay, so it did a study in 2018 in St. Paul to look at the number of units available for a family of four making $30,000 or less. And the number was 0%. There were 0 units, 0% vacancy at that time in June of 2018. So we built some more units became available. We looked the next year, that number was 0%. And so, yes, the number of units have increased, but also population and demands have as well. And so you might be wondering, COVID, how did that affect it? Where are we at now? Let's switch over to Minneapolis. This is the area median income by household size. Okay, so this is what's considered AMI. When we look at vacancies for looking at the various percentage, if you want to spend 50% of your income, there are some units available. But going from 50 to 30%, if you really want to find something that is considered not cost burden, in 2022, there were 0 units available at the time that they took this, right? So it is a problem. When we say we have an affordable housing problem, it means that when people have the resources to put into housing, to say, okay, I'm ready to take that next step, they're looking and not finding anything, right? And that is where the problem lies. It's not so much about certainly access is a problem, but we can start here by saying people don't even know where to look. And think about, again, in my housing journey, the app that I had on my phone that I paid for that gave me notifications when a rental unit that checked these boxes came up, I was able to send an email immediately and get an interview, right? Like that is part of my how I am interplaying with the housing system. And I was also looking for the cheapest, best option, right? Most people usually are. I want it to be the best that it can be for the least amount that I could spend. Thinking about university students, certainly these are what they're thinking about as well. And so I was thinking about, I was looking through some things specifically on Minnesota as a state and found last year's report on housing from the state of Minnesota. And they gave the number that 1 in 4 of Minnesota households are housing cost burdened, which just means you're paying more than 30% of your income. And they gave some other things I thought was also relevant to our conversation, that people experiencing homelessness have a life expectancy that is 26 to 36 years less than those who are not homeless. And as a result of systematic oppression oppression such as redlining and segregation in neighborhoods. There is this idea and this theory that has been proven over and over again that your zip code is a better predictor of your health than your genetic code, right? So now we're talking about homelessness being a problem for your health. We know that to be true, a pretty intense problem. And we also know that where you live impacts your health, including the likelihood of becoming homeless, right? Because of housing instability and economic issues. And then lastly, Minnesota, thinking about home ownership, Minnesota is home to the greatest disparity in home ownership rates between white and non-white residents in the nation. It's something like 75% for white and 45% for African-American families. So that is a lot, right? That is a lot of information. And I will be sending these slides to everyone. So I hope you don't feel that you need to get every single statistic on there. But in terms of what we do about it, what are we doing about it? I love this quote by Ben McBride, who says, the wrong question is, what do I need to do? The right question is, who do I need to become? How is my disposition changing toward housing, toward a population who is experiencing housing insecurity? How am I interacting and being in that space? And so I will give just a little bit of what we are doing, kind of broadly speaking, right? Which is that, when we're talking about that flow, we would like to consider our work. The goal here is for homelessness to be rare, brief, and non-reoccurring, right? So if it's to be rare, we have to start with those people who are at risk of homelessness, those who are housing insecure. And there are ways in which we work along with other agencies to work with those individuals to try and stop that first night on the street. We don't want people to be HUD, federally defined homeless. We want them to never have to take their kids out into the street for that first night. So diversion, as an example, to pull out that here, is a program that has recently, just this first week in January, been officially expanded in Hennepin County. And that is a creative and innovative way of essentially problem solving with someone to say, how can we invest a little bit so that we don't have to invest a lot in your homelessness situation, right? So whether that is a bus ticket to family in another state or a one-time rental assistance, diversion is simply this, not simply, quite complicated. We have incredible people who are doing this work, but problem solving for someone to try and just keep them stably housed and not on the street, because the statistics really change once you spend that first night on the street. So that's something I want to pull out here. And so we're trying to stop that. Once people are experiencing homelessness, we want to make that experience as brief as possible. And then stopping the flow of homelessness, so getting people into permanent housing solutions, including permanent supportive housing, which, when you hear that, permanent supportive housing, we're talking about an umbrella program in which landlords opt into it. And you're in a unit that is your own, but you also have a social worker, you have assistance. And oftentimes it comes with some financial benefit of, having your linens paid for or laundry detergent, so that it's not just putting you into a unit, everything is on your own, but permanent supportive housing has that support wrapped into it. One example of that, and this begins our invitation into advocacy in these next steps, is housing support. Housing support is a program really aimed at veterans, seniors, and those who have disabilities and are on disability. And as it stands, people who are in that program, who specifically have unearned income, is what we would call it, for like veterans benefits, disability, can be spending up to 90%. So they're giving 90% of that income for housing. They get some back. So you get $111 back a month, which some of your basic needs like food, 3 meals a day, linens are taken care of, but you still have, if you have a phone, transportation, really makes saving not possible if you think about $111 a month for all of these extra things, clothing, right? And so something we're working on in coalition with others is trying to advocate for a 30% income cap. So if we're talking about affordable housing, not spending more than 30% of your income, why should that not apply to some programs that are in some benefit programs, right? We want to make housing support affordable is one thing you will see if you sign up for our action alerts that you can do moving forward, is following this and helping us to make that change. That's just one example of a barrier for people. And so I'm gonna end with these recommendations. And for those who want to stick around a bit after for questions, I welcome them, but I don't want to take up too much extra of your time. But my recommendations start personal, and that is when we are in community with others, and but before we start to be this kind of external advocate, asking ourselves, how am I having this hard internal conversation with myself? What biases and thoughts, preconceptions do I have about a housing insecure population, about the Project 8 or the Section 8 unit that's down the hallway from me, for the building, the apartment complex down the street? What biases and perceptions and experiences do I have that are playing into my inability to have that empathy and sympathy that we're called to, right? What patterns of hardships do our neighbors have, or that are our neighbors experiencing? I love the phrase, move yourself to be moved. Maybe that's volunteering, but physically moving yourself out of a comfort zone, physically moving yourself outside of your personal housing situation to experience others. That can be physical, like going to a shelter and volunteering, learning, doing some education there at our Opportunity Center in St. Paul or Minneapolis. But then also moving yourself in a metaphorical way, like reading books, podcasts, news articles that share some of these stories with you. I think about the book Evicted, based out of Milwaukee, that gives a lot of stories around eviction that is incredibly powerful. And then for personal relationship, it starts with trust, but there really is nothing like someone sharing a story about their experience with the housing system. And so that's going to be different for everybody. It's not always easy to hear those. And that's why books, podcasts, news is so important. But when you can, trying to build those relationships, because proximity builds empathy and distance breeds suspicion, is one of my favorite quotes from a mentor in Omaha. And then resisting black and white thinking. So when you hear someone use these kind of either or, you probably know that they're missing something, right? That there's some gray area here. Thinking about that, like motivation and responsibility equals success and housing stability, right? If people were just more motivated, they could be more stably housed. That there's this like false equivalency, and that there is either unsheltered or sheltered, right? We talked about the housing continuum, or that you're either unsheltered and homeless or you're stably housed. There's a lot of in between here. And that's what so many of our guests are working towards, is that housing stability. That you're either choosing between neighborhood safety or affordable housing, right? That we hear these all the time. And I think that they can be good red flags for us to say, okay, what am I missing? What stories aren't here? What stories could I learn from? Right. And so in that way, we can stay curious. And then on a communal level, the kind of larger invitation here, having a conversation with another person, whether that be in a book club or a committee, questioning people who have their own preconceptions. We're going to be sending out information this spring about an opportunity to do some of the charity work via like our giving tree, but during Easter, a giving basket. So look out for that. If you have connections to landlords, or you're part of a community like a parish where there's landlords in the pew, thinking about how are those individuals thinking about who they're renting to? That's a hard conversation. But we need advocates who have those connections to bring people who have that kind of power into the conversation. And then we would love to come speak with your community. We would love to come do one of these workshops, a smaller conversation, facilitating something in your space. And then this is a very practical, and again, you're going to get these in an email, but in a way that you can personally interact with the community, I recommend saving referral resources to your phone. So when you encounter someone in need, you have various resources that you know about that you can say, have you tried or do you know about XYZ, right? From the new diversion number, the hotline, the Hennepin Shelter Hotline that was just released this week. So if you're in Hennepin County, that's one to have in your phone and know about. 211 is kind of the phone tree for housing, rental assistance, shelter. The DV line, the day one crisis for domestic violence, that's an important number you could have in your phone. Knowing about Homeline Minnesota, which gives free legal resources for renters and tenants. These are the kinds of things that unless you are told about them, you might not know about them if your housing journey hasn't brought you to them before, right? And so having them, you can be a resource for others, and that's incredibly powerful. So again, I will send these to folks. And then lastly, I invite everyone here to join our advocacy network if you're not a part of it. That housing support issue that we're going to be working on, as well as expanding public funding. That's something that you can learn about through our colleague Lily's regular legislative updates. So it's educational, but it's also a call to action. When we have petitions or calls that need to be made about some of these issues, that's the best place to go. So cctwincities.org/advocate is a wonderful way to get involved and to stick with us as we're trying to do some of this systemic work in the coming months and years. So with that, I want to allow those who really have to go. I want to respect your time, but I would welcome any questions that you have, thoughts, takeaways as we depart tonight. And I'm happy to stick around for those who have longer questions. Also, if this is an open invitation for anyone who wants to grab a cup of coffee and talk about these things, happy to do that at any time. So any questions that are kind of bubbling up for you that you have? Okay, well, if anyone wants to stick around and chat, or if you have, you can always send me an email as well. I'll make sure that you have all the information in a follow-up email to reach out at any time. I'm really grateful for you giving your time. Again, for those, I'm sorry for the reschedule. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about this. And I hope you have a great Epiphany and Happy New Year to everyone. Thanks all.